February 1st, 1979. 5 million people lined the streets of Tehran. They waited for one man. Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off the plane, and the crowd surged forward. They expected the end of corruption. They expected the end of the Shah's secret police. Why did the celebration turn into a purge? The promises were clear, but the reality was different. The footage shows thousands of people chanting in unison, their faces filled with fervor. But behind the scenes, the mechanics of power were already shifting. Khomeini did not just return to pray. He returned to dismantle an entire state. He organized committees, armed loyalists, and established revolutionary courts. At first glance, a liberation, but in reality, the birth of a new iron fist. The change happened fast. In the early days, moderate politicians sat at the table. Within months, they were gone. Some fled across the border. Others ended up in the cells of Evin prison. Faith was no longer a personal matter. It became a tool for the state. It became a weapon used against anyone who disagreed. Events accelerated. The new authorities began checking every house and every office. They looked for ties to the old regime. They looked for enemies of God. The camera records. Short trials held in schoolrooms and basements. No lawyers, no appeals. The sound of gavel strikes was followed quickly by the sound of firing squads. The transition from monarchy to theocracy was not a transition of peace, it was a transition of blood. There was no turning back. Thus, the new era began. September 24th, 1902. Ruhollah was born in the town of Khomein. This was a poor, conservative territory in the center of Iran. At this time, the Qajar dynasty held the throne. The monarchy was weak and crumbling. They had lost control over the provinces. Local landowners and tribal leaders held the real power. Armed groups moved freely through the hills. Law did not exist for everyone. Justice depended on the size of a man's militia. Violence was a daily tool. Why did Ruhollah's father die? Syed Mustafa Khomeini was a local religious figure. He did not stay silent. He challenged the local landowners and defended the villagers against high taxes. He created enemies among the elite. In early 1903, the trap was set. Syed was traveling near Khomein when gunmen opened fire. He died in the dirt. He was shot dead when Ruhollah was only 5 months old. The attackers were not bandits. They were men linked to the ruling class. They saw Syed as a threat to their influence. The killers were never arrested. No one went to prison. The state did nothing. This event was a clear signal. Power protected its own, and justice was a weapon for the strong. At first glance, it was a simple murder, but in reality, it was the start of a blood feud. The Khomeini household changed. The smell of incense and the sound of mourning filled the rooms. Ruhollah was raised by his mother, Hajar, and his aunt, Sahiba. They did not let him forget the murder. They spoke of the father as a martyr. They told the boy that standing against injustice was a duty. In their stories, death was not an end, it was a sacrifice. The camera records the reality of the era, dusty roads and starving children. Iran was falling apart. Britain and Russia tore at the borders. Famine struck the villages, disease followed the hunger. In Khomein, schools were rare and survival was the only goal. There were no luxuries, only the cold reality of life in a failing state. Events accelerated. Ruhollah watched as the world around him burned. He learned 2 things early. First, the law was a lie. Second, the only thing that mattered was the strength to resist. The boy grew up in the shadow of the grave. 1918. This was the year death became a constant companion for young Ruhollah. He grew up in a world where life was cheap and protection was non-existent. Tragedy arrived in waves. 1917 saw the death of his aunt, Sahiba. Only 1 year later, in 1918, his mother Hajar passed away. At 16 years old, Ruhollah was alone. His entire immediate family was gone. Relatives took him in, but the damage was irreversible. Injustice and loss were no longer events, they were his environment. What did this trauma create? It shaped a specific mindset. He did not see suffering as a tragedy to be avoided. He saw it as a source of moral power. To Ruhollah, Those who endured pain earned the right to rule others. Violence was not a problem to solve. It was a tool to shape history and punish enemies. The teenage boy moved through religious schools. First, he studied in local classrooms. Later, he transferred to larger centers. These institutions provided more than just lessons. They provided structure. In a chaotic world, religion offered certainty. It also offered a path to absolute control. In areas where the state was weak, people feared and obeyed the clerics. Ruhollah watched this dynamic closely. A realization followed. Religious authority did not need elections. It did not need written laws. It commanded loyalty through faith and fear. At this time, Iran was a failing state. Corruption was everywhere. Foreign powers took control of trade and seized natural resources. The central government offered no protection to its citizens. Clerics pointed to the decay. They blamed secular rule and foreign interference for the national collapse. Ruhollah absorbed these ideas completely. To him, the suffering of the people was not a failure of economics. It was proof that society had abandoned strict religious control. 1920. Ruhollah moved to Qom. This city was the center of religious thought. The move was the final step in his transformation. He left his broken childhood behind to join the ranks of the powerful. The foundations for a revolutionary were now in place. 1921. Ruhollah arrived in the city of Qom. This was not a simple move for a student. Qom functioned as the nerve center of Iranian Shia Islam. It was a factory for religious authority. Clerics there did not just study texts, they built networks to control entire regions. By entering these gates, Ruhollah chose a path toward political power. He did not seek mere scholarship. He mastered Islamic law, Arabic grammar, and complex theology. He spent years under the guidance of senior clerics. His daily routine was rigid. He woke before dawn. He studied until late at night. He did not socialize. He never joked. The footage of his early years shows a man who rarely smiled. His focus was limited to three things: strict belief, strict rules, and strict obedience. By the 1930s, Ruhollah transitioned from student to master. He began gathering his own followers. On the surface, he was a quiet teacher. He spoke in low tones. He lived a modest life, but in reality, he was a radical. His private views were uncompromising. He believed secular governments were fundamentally illegitimate. He rejected the concept of popular sovereignty. To him, the idea that ordinary citizens could choose their leaders was a flaw. He viewed elections as a threat to divine order. He saw parliaments as weak institutions. For Ruhollah, laws written by men were worthless. Only laws enforced by clerics held authority. He wanted total control. His vision was absolute. Religious scholars would oversee every aspect of life. They would run the courts. They would dictate daily behavior. They would manage the economy. There was no room for compromise. Events accelerated in the 1940s. Ruhollah began writing. He printed and circulated texts that targeted the modern legal system. He did not hide his support for violence. His writings defended physical punishments. He called for public beatings and amputations. To him, these were valid tools of the state. He saw them as necessary for a disciplined society. But the world was shifting around him. By the early 1960s, Iran began a rapid transformation. Mohammad Reza Shah moved to consolidate his power. The monarch wanted to modernize the nation at high speed. He believed Western-style reforms would prevent a revolution. He planned to change the land, the schools, and the law. January 1963. The Shah prepared to launch his program. The confrontation was inevitable. January 1963. The Shah launched the White Revolution. This was a massive government reform program designed to dismantle the old Iranian social structure. The plan focused on 6 main points. The government seized large land estates from wealthy owners. They divided these properties into small plots for peasants. They expanded public education into rural villages. Women gained the right to vote and run for political office. Religious courts lost their jurisdiction over family law. On paper, the goal was clear: end poverty and modernize the nation. But these reforms created a powerful enemy. The Shiite clergy watched their influence evaporate. They lost their land, their steady income, and their legal authority over the people. Ruhollah Khomeini reacted with more intensity than his peers. He did not view the White Revolution as a policy shift. He viewed it as a declaration of war against Islam. Why did Khomeini fight back? The Shah believed he was building a future. Khomeini believed the Shah was destroying a faith. He accused the throne of corrupting society and acting as a puppet for foreign powers. He specifically targeted women's suffrage. In his view, allowing women to vote would collapse the moral order of the household. His sermons changed. They grew louder, sharper, and more aggressive. June 1963. It was the month of Muharram. Khomeini delivered a series of speeches that crossed a line. He challenged the Shah's right to rule. These recordings didn't just stay in the mosques. They moved through hidden religious networks like fire. Protests ignited in Tehran and Qom. The footage from those days shows chaos. Thousands of men filled the streets, shouting slogans against the monarchy. The government did not negotiate. They sent in the tanks. Soldiers moved into position and loaded live ammunition. For several days, the sound of gunfire echoed through the city centers. The result was a massacre. Hundreds of protesters died on the asphalt. Some witnesses claimed the death toll reached into the thousands. The regime never released the true numbers. They buried the bodies and cleared the streets. Events accelerated. Shortly after the blood stopped flowing, the police moved in. Ruhollah Khomeini was arrested in his home. The Shah's agents took him to a prison cell for interrogation. The monarch believed that by removing the leader, he could kill the movement. But this was only the beginning. June 1963. The Shah believed that putting the cleric behind bars would silence the streets. He was wrong. The arrest backfired immediately. Instead of a prisoner, the regime created a martyr. Thousands of Iranians heard the name Ruhollah for the first time. They didn't see a criminal. They saw a holy man standing against a monarch. The price of his defiance was a prison cell. Why did the Shah let him go? He underestimated the man. After several months, the prison gates opened and Ruhollah walked out. The regime expected him to be humbled, but he didn't step back. He didn't lower his voice. He became more aggressive. 1964. The Iranian government passed a new law. It gave American military advisors and their families full legal immunity on Iranian soil. An American could commit a crime and the local police could not touch him. Iranian courts were powerless. This was the spark. Ruhollah launched a public attack. He called the law a national humiliation. He spoke of lost independence and sold sovereignty. This wasn't just about religion anymore. He talked about dignity. The message resonated. Secular nationalists and religious students began to listen to the same man. At first glance, the law was a diplomatic formality. But in reality, it was the end of the Shah's credibility. The Shah changed his strategy. Arrest had failed. He decided Ruhollah was a virus that needed to be removed from the body of the country. November 1964. Security forces moved in. There was no warning. They put him on a plane and forced him across the border into Turkey. But the plan failed again. Exile didn't quiet him. It gave him safety. He eventually moved to Najaf, Iraq. This was a center of Shiite power, filled with prestigious religious schools. From here, the Shah's secret police could not reach him. In the frame, the streets of Najaf, old stone walls and thousands of students. He was no longer reacting to the Shah's moves. He was building a blueprint. During these years in Iraq, he finalized his most radical theory. It was called Vilayat-e-Faqih. The concept was simple. One single religious jurist would rule everything. This man would not just lead prayers. He would command the army. He would appoint the judges. He would write the laws. There would be no checks. There would be no balances. No opposition would be tolerated. The public would not participate. They would obey. The vision for a new Iran was ready. Thus began the long wait for the revolution. 1979. The old order collapsed. Ruhollah Khomeini did not believe in choice. He taught that elections were a source of chaos and weakness. To him, dissent was synonymous with corruption. He argued that showing mercy to enemies was a fatal mistake. It only allowed them to regroup and return stronger. His system was built on a single foundation: punishment without appeal and execution without apology. How did a man in exile reach the masses? The answer was plastic and magnetic tape. His lectures were recorded on cheap cassette tapes. In the 1970s, this technology was accessible and easy to hide. Supporters packed the tapes into false bottoms of suitcases. They tucked them into ordinary postal packages. They smuggled them across the Iranian border. The tapes played in secret. They were heard in private living rooms, small repair shops, and back rooms of mosques. The volume remained low. The message spread through students, factory workers, and religious families. These groups already viewed the Shah with suspicion. The promise was blunt and simple: remove the Shah and justice returns. Faith is restored. Iran becomes independent. But there was a hidden price. What was not emphasized was the human cost. Khomeini was clear on one point: enemies would not be debated. They would be removed. The list of targets grew long. Political rivals, secular intellectuals, and leftist groups were marked. Even clerics who disagreed were labeled enemies of religion. For years, the Shah made a critical error. He underestimated the movement. Meanwhile, the country began to fracture. Inflation rose. Unemployment climbed. Public anger over government corruption reached a boiling point. The secret police, the Savak, responded with force. They arrested thousands and killed hundreds. The footage from that era shows the result. Crowds face lines of soldiers. The sound of gunfire echoes in the streets. Each act of repression served Khomeini's narrative. Every dead protester became a martyr. Every funeral became a new protest. The system appeared evil in the eyes of the public. By the late 1970s, the demonstrations turned into a flood. Millions of people occupied the city squares. The Shah's forces fired into the crowds. The cycle was unbreakable. Blood fed outrage. Outrage fed rebellion. At first glance, a religious movement. But in reality, a total revolution. Events accelerated. The Shah's grip slipped from the levers of power. He had the military and the weapons, but he had lost the streets. The momentum shifted toward the tapes and the man behind them. There was no turning back. Thus, the revolution began. 14 years of exile ended. Iran expelled Ruhollah and he relocated to France, settling in the suburbs of Paris. From a small house in Noailles-le-Château, he gained something he lacked in Iraq: international media access. Journalists from every major global network arrived. Direct phone lines connected him to his network in Tehran. His voice reached further than ever before. February 1st, 1979. At 9:33 in the morning, his plane touched down at Mehrabad Airport. He had been gone for 15 years. The Shah was no longer there to stop him. 2 weeks earlier, the monarch had fled the country, leaving behind an empty throne and a power vacuum. Why did the regime collapse so quickly? It had weapons and money, but the people no longer feared the state. The scale of the arrival was unprecedented. Millions of people flooded the streets, stretching from the airport gates to the heart of the city. It was one of the largest public gatherings in human history. The footage shows a sea of black and gray. People climbed onto rooftops. They stood on the roofs of moving cars. They packed the highways until traffic became impossible. Every eye looked toward the sky. They didn't see a politician. They saw a savior who would end decades of repression. The country was already in a state of total collapse. The Iranian army was paralyzed and divided between generals and deserting soldiers. Police stations stood empty, their doors kicked in and files scattered. Government offices stopped functioning. No one was processing paperwork or collecting taxes. In this chaos, Ruhollah acted with absolute calm. He presented himself as the only moral authority in a broken land. He did not negotiate. He did not compromise. He immediately rejected the remaining royal government and declared it illegal. Events accelerated. Within days, he appointed his own interim government. He ignored all formal legal processes and constitutional requirements. Power shifted overnight. It did not move through the law. It moved through raw loyalty. The legal system was the first casualty. Existing courts were shut down. Judges were forced out of their offices. In their place, revolutionary tribunals appeared almost immediately. These new courts operated without written rules or defense attorneys. The footage from these moments is stark. Judges were often clerics or loyalists with zero legal training. Trials were held behind closed doors, often in the middle of the night. There was no right to appeal. There were no witnesses for the defense. Accusations alone were enough to seal a fate. There was no turning back. January 1979. Committees of the Islamic Revolution took control of the streets. These armed groups operated without central oversight. They established roadblocks at every major intersection. They moved through residential districts with lists of names. They kicked down doors and searched private basements. Anyone tied to the Pahlavi administration became a target. Former generals, intelligence officers, high-ranking ministers, judges. Soldiers dragged them from their beds in the middle of the night. No warrants were presented. No explanations were given to the families watching from the hallways. The sound of heavy boots and slamming truck doors filled the neighborhoods. Thousands disappeared into makeshift prisons. How did the trials work? At first glance, a judicial process, but in reality, a conveyor belt for death sentences. Executions started within weeks. The proceedings lasted minutes. Some prisoners faced a judge and a firing squad on the same afternoon. There were no defense attorneys. There was no discovery of evidence. Guards used physical force to extract signed confessions. Rights of appeal were abolished. By March 1979, the death toll reached the hundreds. The footage from the era shows the aftermath. Firing squads lined up against concrete walls. The sound of synchronized rifle fire. Bodies were loaded into unmarked trucks and buried in secret pits. Officials issued a final command to the families: no public mourning, no funerals, and no headstones. But this was only the beginning. Ruhollah Khomeini began the process of consolidating absolute power. He no longer needed his former partners. During the revolution, a broad coalition had fought the Shah. Marxists, nationalists, and secular liberals had manned the barricades together. They expected a seat at the table. They expected a pluralistic government. They were wrong. The new regime labeled these groups as enemies of God or counter-revolutionaries. The pattern was repetitive and precise. First, state-backed mobs attacked their headquarters. Then, the Revolutionary Guard arrested their leaders. Finally, the courts delivered the same sentences used against the Shah's men. Events accelerated. Some activists managed to reach the border and flee. Those who stayed faced the gallows or long prison terms. The revolution began to consume its own creators. The media was the final hurdle. The camera records the closing of printing presses. Authorities shut down over 40 independent newspapers in a single sweep. Journalists were intercepted on their way to work. They were interrogated, imprisoned, or silenced by the threat of violence. There was no turning back. The new order was now total.